This video has been sponsored by Squarespace. In my various explorations of Tolkien's works, I've learned that he really loved rewriting things. That's why The Lord of the Rings took almost 20 years for him to complete. It's why the Silmarillion was never finished in his lifetime. But the thing is that Tolkien didn't just enjoy rewriting his own works, but also the works of others, especially the fragmented legends and poems of Old Europe. Many of these rewrites, or what I like to think of as Tolkien's personal fan fictions, have been published today, and by taking a closer look at how Tolkien rewrote these ancient tales, how he reshaped traditional ideas, and how he used the tools of the past to tell a story for the present, we can learn a whole lot more about Tolkien as both a writer and a reader. Just a quick warning that you are going to want to watch this video in its entirety, because at the very end, I have something very special to share with you. You might even call it a trailer, so be sure to stick around to the very end of this video. And speaking of the end of this video, before we get to the end of this video, I want to tell you about this video's sponsor, Squarespace. Squarespace is the all-in-one website building platform that's going to allow you to stand out and succeed online. And you can get your website discovered fast with Squarespace's integrated SEO tools. Every one of their websites is optimized to be indexed with meta descriptions, an auto-generated sitemap, and more. All the things that you need to show up on search engines and bring in more customers. With your Squarespace site, you're going to be able to run email campaigns, collect donations, and monetize the things you make. You can sell access to online courses, blogs, videos, and memberships. All you have to do is set the price and choose between charging a one-time fee or a subscription. It couldn't be easier. If you're interested in refreshing an existing brand or creating a totally new one, Squarespace is the place to do it. Just head down to squarespace.com for a completely free trial, and when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/JessoftheShire to get 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. Thanks so much to Squarespace for sponsoring this video, and thanks to all of you for checking out my sponsors. One of Tolkien's lifelong passions was the Old English poem Beowulf. Only one copy of Beowulf, dating from around the year 1000, has survived the test of time, but the original tale is thought to be much older. Beowulf spins the tale of the titular hero, and his rise to prominence, and his eventual downfall, all loosely set in 5th and 6th century Scandinavia. And especially in the 19th and early 20th century, much of the scholarly work around Beowulf was focused on trying to dig out those little hints of history from the poem Beowulf. But for Tolkien, it was never about that. Tolkien loved Beowulf for the story itself, for the way that it built on and deconstructed notions of heroism, for the fearsomeness of its monsters, and for the ways in which the echoes of Beowulf can still be felt in stories today. In his groundbreaking essay, Beowulf, the Monsters and the Critics, Tolkien used the following allegory to explain the problems that he had with academic treatments of Beowulf up until this time. Imagine that there's a man who inherits a plot of land on which there are the ruins of an ancient hall. The man, because he owns the land, he takes the stones and he uses them to build himself a beautiful tower. Now the man's friends come over to see the tower that he's built, and they recognize that the stones it is constructed of are much older than the tower itself. And so they want a closer look. They want to see where the bricks came from, how old they are, what they're made of. And in this investigation, they tear the tower apart, piece by piece. They come away from this somewhat wiser when it comes to the history of the minutiae, the tiny little details, but they have no respect or understanding of what those bricks had been a part of. Because with that tower that was built from the old and rebuilt new, the man who had built it had been able to catch a glimpse of the sea. Roughly 5 years after writing this essay, Tolkien decided not just to investigate the tower that had been built, but the foundations that may have laid under that ancient hall. and he did so in a piece called Sellic Spell. Its title is pulled from a line in Beowulf, where they talk about a Sellic spell, or a wondrous tale, as Tolkien translates it, and Tolkien describes Sellic Spell as, "It is only to a limited extent an attempt to reconstruct the Anglo-Saxon tale that lies behind the folk tale element in Beowulf." So Sellic Spell proposes to be Tolkien's take on what the folklore may have looked like that the Beowulf poet read or heard that inspired him to write the Beowulf poem. To recreate this folklore, Tolkien relies on the bear's son folkloric pattern. The motif of the bear's son appears everywhere in folklore and fairy tales, from North America to Germany, and many of these stories follow a very similar structure. They feature a boy who is raised by bears or born of bears, who has some kind of innate superhuman strength. Although this boy struggles to fit into human society, he goes out on an adventure to defeat a supernatural beast, generally descending into water or earth to confront them, and in defeating the monster, the bear boy becomes hero. Not only does this folklore pattern hit most of the points of Beowulf's story beat for beat, but Beowulf's name is derived from the Old English term for bee wolf. You know, a bear, one who hunts bees. In Sellic Spell, Tolkien boils all of these layers down and presents us with the character called Beowulf, a boy who is found in the lair of a bear. Having been raised by wild animals, Beowulf struggles to integrate himself into garish society. He's too strong, he's too powerful. He can't use any tools or weapons because his hands are so strong that they snap anything that he holds. His youth is scattered with tales of fights and challenges, including a swimming match with a man named Breaker. None of this context is given in the original poem, except that someone later brings up the swimming match that Beowulf had with a man named Brecca rather than Breaker, but this context does help the story make a lot more sense. In the original poem, we enter in media res when Beowulf has already made a name for himself and is already a fairly well-known hero, but in Sellic Spell, we get to see how he became a hero, how he got his legendary strength. Just as it is in the poem, word arrives of the Golden Hall under attack, and our hero goes out to prove himself. But in Sellic Spell, he specifically takes with him a man named Handshoe, called such because he wears gloves, shoes for the hands, that allow him to rip stones apart with these gloves on. Along the way, they also meet with a man named Ashwood, who's immensely skilled with a spear. Handshoe is a character comparable to Handshoe from the original Beowulf poem, who's a bit of an anomaly of a character. He's one of the Geats that comes with Beowulf over to the Hall of Hrothgar and Heorot, but he is immediately killed on the very first night, and we never really get any more context for why he's called Handshoe, which is the translated version of Handshoe. Ashwood is developed from a relatively minor character, one of the soldiers who comes to greet Beowulf when he lands on Hrothgar's shores, but he does help to put Handshoe in better context. These two fit well into the helpful companion archetype, and thus when they are immediately killed when they face the beast, it both marks out a raising of the stakes for Beowulf's character, and it proves just how skilled Beowulf is when compared to any other human being. The monster, by the way, is named Grinder rather than Grendel, but the fight between Grinder and Beowulf plays out fairly similarly, with Beowulf gripping onto the monster's arm, and the monster struggling and tearing his own arm off. But because Tolkien laid the groundwork for us, telling us how Beowulf's grip was so strong that he could break metal tools just with his grip, it makes a lot more sense as to why Beowulf is gifted with such superhuman strength. Shaping out the cast is also Unfriend, clearly derived from the character of Unferth from the original tale. Unferth is a relatively minor character. He pops up to challenge Beowulf's integrity, and then acknowledges he was wrong when Beowulf proves himself. Tolkien's Unfriend takes on a much more present role, as he's sent with Beowulf to try and finish off Grendel down in the lake. But when they reach the shore, he proves himself to be a coward, once more reinforcing how much more powerful and brave Beowulf is when compared to normal men. This character isn't radically changed by his presentation in Sellic Spell, but Tolkien gives him a little bit more meat and a little bit more grounding to work with. In the lake, Beowulf is ambushed by the mother of Grindr, who he's able to defeat with a little bit of magical intervention, and then he goes and finds Grindr and finishes him off as well. And it is there that the tale concludes, with Beowulf being sent home lauded as a hero. Tolkien concludes, "A great lord he became, with broad lands and many rings, and he wedded the king's only daughter. And after the king's day was done, Beowulf became king in his stead, and lived long in glory. As long as he lived, he loved honey dearly, and the mead in his hall was ever of the best." If you're at all familiar with the original tale of Beowulf, this ending might prove a bit of a shock to you. After all, the original tale contains the all-important third act, in which King Beowulf, now long in his years, must face off against one final monster, a great dragon. In his pride, Beowulf wants to go into this fight alone, and it is this pride that gets him killed, leaving his kingdom abandoned. Tolkien never elaborated on exactly why he made these changes, but I can hazard a couple of guesses. First off, Tolkien loved a happy ending. Eucatastrophe was his lifeblood. He liked it when a story ended with everything going right, so I imagine that there was a part of him that wanted to see this story that he loved so much finally get a happy ending. It's more satisfying and less grim and intellectually stimulating. As is, Sellic Spell is a pretty simple confirmation of the heroic values of the time when the Beowulf story may have originated. And as always, when it comes to these ancient stories, context is very important. The original Beowulf story was first conceived and spread in an environment that was completely non-Christian. The extant Beowulf manuscript, however, was almost positively written by a Christian author. This Christian author was also writing at a time when a lot of the stories of the old world, a lot of these stories with a non-Christian and pagan basis, were being rewritten to fit more in with the Christian tradition that was taking over Europe. Thus, the Beowulf manuscript that we have contains the roots of an older story, but is also pasted over with a veneer of Christianity. And this contrast produces some really fascinating moments of tension in the Beowulf poem. Beowulf consigns himself to the lot of weird fate, saying, "Ga thou weird swahio shell, fate goes ever as it must," but he also says that God's providence is at work in his life. In this story, the old pagan desire for glory in battle over all else is at odds with the Christian warnings against pride and aiming towards an eternal reward of goodness rather than sheer notoriety. The ending of the Beowulf poem, in which the old hero strives to reclaim the pride of his youth and is summarily killed for that, feels very fable-like. It feels like a parable, a Christian author using and reshaping this story to condemn the old world sensibilities. It could very well be interpreted as an author showing what happens to the old world hero when the old days are now gone. And perhaps this is why Tolkien didn't include the third act in Sellic Spell, because it's kind of debatable as to whether or not that aspect was part of the original story. Now, am I proposing that the dragon sequence was invented by the anonymous Beowulf poet? No, not really. We just can't say that for certainty. No one is alive from that time for the most part. But I do think that it's worth noting that the tone and shape of that ending was absolutely informed by the person writing it. And the person writing it was a Christian writing about non-Christian characters who was undoubtedly trying to send a message. Either way, it makes for a really interesting thought experiment to compare the authorial tone and the choices made by a poem like Beowulf and a story like Sellic Spell. By giving his fictional foundational text a happy ending, Tolkien begs some very pertinent questions about the tone and the contents of the original poem. He winnows the tale down to its essentials, but also filters it through the past, crawling back through the pages of storytelling history to try and see how this tale may have transformed across time and across narrators. Sellic Spell wasn't just written for entertainment purposes. In a very interesting way, it acts almost as literary archaeology. It is a rewrite that, in its nature, calls into question the act of rewriting. But we must remember that Tolkien was a huge fan of Beowulf. But what about his rewrites of material that he wasn't as much of a fan of? Tolkien's incomplete poem, The Fall of Arthur, serves as both a love letter and a condemnation of the material on which it is based. Tolkien's relationship with the tales of King Arthur was, to put it simply, quite complex. He wrote of the Arthurian canon. Powerful as it is imperfectly naturalized, associated with the soil of Britain, but not with the English, and does not replace what I felt to be missing. For one thing, it is too fairy, too lavish and fantastical, incoherent and repetitive. For another and more important thing, it is involved in and explicitly contains the Christian religion. Tolkien's problems with the Arthurian canon were multifaceted, and his primary issue was that they overtly contained Christianity. I go far more into depth in this in another video, which I will show here and link below if you want to check it out. But basically, Tolkien's issue was that he thought that if you included elements of overt Christianity, prayers, miracles, even holy grails, in a fantasy story, that had the tendency to cheapen those ideas, and those themes, and those holy relics. There's an implication that because we're kind of lumping these things in with the other dressings of fantasy, dragons and witches and old world monsters, that these Christian things are also part of the fantasy. And as a devout Catholic who believed that these things were not fantasy, Tolkien bristled at that. The Arthurian tales are also by nature imprecise and imperfect, like Tolkien said, and that's because there is no one singular author of the Arthurian canon. The collective tales of King Arthur developed across centuries and across continents. It is a repetitive, muddled myth, and to Tolkien, it just wasn't English enough. Although they do technically take place in England for the most part, the tales of King Arthur really took off in places other than England, in France, in other parts of continental Europe, and they adopted the storytelling traditions of the areas in which these stories were being told. By the time we got the Arthurian canon, as we know it today, there's not a lot of that story that is actually really English or written by English authors. Thus, the Arthurian myth was simply not the type of fantasy that Tolkien liked to read. And this is where The Fall of Arthur comes in. The Fall of the Arthur was composed at some point in the early 30s, just as Tolkien was beginning to marinate the ideas that would become The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, and although it was later abandoned, we can see a lot of the ideas that would become Tolkien's hallmarks beginning to take shape in this poem. Tolkien draws his material largely from the alliterative Morte Arthur and the last books in Sir Thomas Malory's Le Morte d'Arthur, in which Arthur is leading one last campaign onto the continent as Roman rule trickles out of Europe. When he's absent from his kingdom, his wife Guinevere falls in with the chivalric knight Lancelot, and the wicked Mordred makes a bid at the throne. And by the time that Arthur returns, war has erupted, and Arthur is perilously injured. The Fall of Arthur takes us right into Arthur's continental campaign as he reaches the borders of the dark Mirkwood, seeking to purge the land of any remaining heathens. Tolkien builds out this world as dark, brooding, and brutal, a world that isn't in its bright spring or even its warm summer, but rather a bitter autumn that is quickly tipping over into a brutal and unending winter. In fact, this is one of the major themes of this work, the idea that the world is decaying, and that in a world like that, a man's passion and spirit must burn all the brighter, like a lamplight flaring brighter to try and see back into the world behind. In The Fall of Arthur, Tolkien writes, "As when the earth dwindles in autumn days, and soon to its setting the sun is waning under mournful mist, then a man will lust for work and wandering, while yet warm floweth blood, sun-kindled, so burned his soul, after long glory for a last essay of pride and prowess, to the proof setting, will unyielding in war with fate. He presents us with a world that is sick on nostalgia, a world that is fading and desperately wants to reclaim what it thinks it once had. This is also an idea that becomes very prominent in The Lord of the Rings. As the magic of the elves departs Middle-earth, as the men look longingly back on the days when they were more powerful and more grand, Tolkien is trying to say that this kind of nostalgia is an unignorable part of the human experience, even within a fantasy world, or in the case of The Fall of Arthur, the good old days themselves. And this is achieved not just through what Tolkien says, but how he says it. The Fall of Arthur is a poem, but it is a poem that does not rely on rhyme as its primary poetic device, as so many poems do today. Rather, he goes back to the world of Old English poetry and uses the traditional alliteration, starting words with the same letter or sound. This type of poetry is stiff, it's far less lyrical, and it almost comes across a bit harsh in its strange poetic beauty, but I think that it contributes a lot to the world and the environment that Tolkien was trying to build. This doesn't feel like a storybook fairy tale, it feels like a legend. Passages read, "There evening came with misty moon, moving slowly through the wind wreckage in the wide heavens, where strands of storm among the stars wandered. Fires were flickering, frail tongues of gold under hoary hills in the huge twilight gleamed ghostly pale on the ground rising, like elvish growths in autumn grass in some hollow of the hills hid from mortals, the tents of Arthur." There's a rugged, poetic beauty to this, a touch of the very grounded fairy and fantasy that Tolkien would access in The Lord of the Rings. But at the heart of this story is actually a scathing critique of the very values upon which this story is built. With the world in decay, the common human instinct is to burn all the brighter, to try and leave one flash of beautiful light before the world all falls into ruin. This is the root of the old European sense of heroism, the Norse and Anglo-Saxon standard. Death certainly comes for us all, but the true hero will fight all the same, making his mark on history so that he may never be forgotten, immortalized in stories. That is precisely what Arthur is trying to do when the story opens. He's trying to reclaim the glory of his youth, cement himself into the history books with one last great campaign. But this yearning for glory has infected his whole kingdom. Arthur's Queen Guinevere has lost herself to her own pride, seeking her own personal fulfillment over all else. She schemes to remain queen, but also to be with her lover, the courtly knight Lancelot. For his part, Lancelot is desperately trying to maintain his role as the model of the chivalric code. His honor demands that he have loyalty to his king, but also to his heart. He cannot follow his heart's choice and be with Guinevere without also betraying his lord. Trapped in his prideful attachment to chivalry, Lancelot has forced himself into a place where every choice is wrong. And Mordred the Foul might just be the most sinful embodiment of pride, for he seeks power above all else. Trapped in a nihilistic world, the characters of The Fall of Arthur seem doomed to fail, but they also seem determined to make the best story out of it before they do. I regard this as one of Tolkien's most bleak and dark works. In his descriptions of Guinevere and Mordred's lust for flesh and for power, he writes some of his most dark and sexually charged passages. In The Fall of Arthur, Tolkien strips away the layers of finery and frills that the Arthurian canon has amassed over the years and throughout history, and he is determined to take this story, this world, and its characters to task. He places an emphasis on the glory of battle, on speeches, on the workings of fate, on shining weapons and glistening armor. He places this story somewhere closer to its original context, the sordid and dark tales that may have originally shaped out the Arthurian canon, and he perhaps owes some of this tone to the Old English poem The Wanderer. In The Wanderer, a poem from the 9th century, a man who was once a warrior has now become a wanderer, and he mourns the days when he was in his king's service. He reminisces on great battles fought and won, on feasts and celebrations, on gifts doled out by his loving lord. He thinks to himself, Hwa quam merg, hwa quam mago, hwa quam mathum yifa, hwa quam simbla yesetu, hwa sindon celedremas. This sentiment, which was later translated directly into The Lord of the Rings, infuses the fall of Arthur, grounding this lofty myth in an aching nostalgia, grief for days long gone and failures yet to come. Tolkien would leave this poem incomplete after just a few chapters, perhaps because it was too bleak for even him, but these ideas would be adopted and brought to fulfillment in The Lord of the Rings, where he was able to address them comprehensively and beautifully, but not give in to their grief. But if there is one work in Tolkien's library that really digs into this theme of the grief of heroism and the agony of the passage of time, it would be The Homecoming of Beorhtnoth. I gotta be honest with you guys, I only just got around to reading The Homecoming of Beorhtnoth, Beorhtholm's son, for this video, frankly because the title confused me, and my brain couldn't figure out how to pronounce Beorhtnoth. But now that I have figured out roughly how to pronounce Beorhtnoth, I gotta say, this is my new favorite Tolkien thing ever. Homecoming, as I will now refer to it so that I don't have to say Beorhtnoth's name too many times, was first published in 1953 in a collection of essays, which is interesting because Homecoming is definitely not an essay at all. It's a piece of creative writing. This was, in fact, something that Tolkien noticed and was a little bit embarrassed by, which is why when he submitted it to this book of essays, he also submitted an essay which explained the creative writing exercise of The Homecoming of Beorhtnoth and why he had written it. Homecoming is actually a short play that acts as a prequel/sequel to the Battle of Maldon. The Battle of Maldon is a fragment of a poem that tells the story of the real Battle of Maldon, a historical event which took place in 991. According to this poem, and to history as we know it, this battle occurred during the Viking attacks on British soil. The British, led by Beorhtnoth, son of Beorhthelm, brought out his troops to meet the incoming Vikings near the village of Maldon. The Vikings originally landed on an island, and they could only access the mainland through a small land bridge that emerged when the seas were at low tide. Problem was, it was a very narrow ford that they were able to cross, and they could only cross a couple at a time, meaning that Beorhtnoth and his retinue of soldiers were able to pick them off quite easily. So the Viking leader appealed to Beorhtnoth's sense of nobility and valor, and asked if Beorhtnoth would allow them all to cross over, and then the battle could resume. He wanted to call a temporary truce until they could all get over there and get themselves settled, and then they would be able to have a proper battle. Beorhtnoth, who is very much a hero in the old sense of the term, decided to take up this offer. And of course, once all the Vikings had safely crossed over, they didn't wait for the truce to be officially called off, and they surprised them with an attack and killed everyone. Beorhtnoth and his very most loyal soldiers were all slaughtered. Beorhtnoth's headless body was taken back to Ely, where it was buried in the abbey, or so history and the poem tells us. Tolkien's Homecoming follows two of these men who are sent out onto the battlefield to retrieve the body of Beorhtnoth and to bring him home. That's why it's called the Homecoming of Beorhtnoth. These men are named Tidwald, or Tida, an older farmer, and Torthelm, or Tora, the younger son of a minstrel. And yes, I get these two names confused constantly because they're two syllables and they start with a T, but as annoying as that is that Tolkien invented those names, the original poem is about a guy named Beorhtnoth and his father Beorhthelm, so it's not like he wasn't working from the historical basis. As they try and pick their way across this pitch-black field covered in dead bodies, Tida and Toda have a rather frank discussion about the true cost of heroism. The world, as Tida acknowledges, is darkening. The songs wither, and the whole world worsens. As they sort through these bodies, they see these young men who had seemed to embody the world and the spirit of old heroism, and they see how that sense of heroism has gotten these men utterly cut down. Tida and Toda finally find Beorhtnoth's headless body, and Tida says, "These are Christian days, though the cross is heavy. Beorhtnoth we bear, not Beowulf here. No pyres for him, nor piling of mounds, and the gold will be given to the good abbot. Let the monks mourn him, and the mass be chanted." Beorhtnoth's actions at the Battle of Maldon were, without a doubt, foolish. He is operating as a hero from the old world, refusing to change despite the fact that they are no longer in that old world. This is not Beowulf the Great, poisoned by the venom of a dragon, burning on a mighty pyre of wood. This is a headless man, laying at the bottom of a pile of corpses that once were his very closest friends and allies. The life of violence that Beorhtnoth has built for himself has only resulted in more violence. And even so, despite the fact that this is his fault, despite the fact that they are looking upon the corpses of the people they once knew, there's a part of them that can't help but admire what Beorhtnoth has done. "Alas, my friend, our lord was at fault," or so in Maldon this morning men were saying. "Too proud, too princely. But his pride's cheated, and his princedom has passed. So we'll praise his valor." There is a distinct conflict here, because their immediate instinct is to see Beorhtnoth's actions as admirable, as really cool. As the son of a minstrel, Toda can recognize how excellent of a story this will one day make. But they're also standing in a field of bodies, the direct results of the kind of heroism that Beorhtnoth sought. This conflict is present in the edges and the undertones of the original Battle of Maldon poem, but Tolkien takes the fringes of this theme and pulls them up to the forefront, using the techniques of the Old English language to take these ideas and place them back into a new context. Although it's written in modern English, and it's quite readable and performable, this poem is written in the poetic stylings of Old English. In its strictest and most perfect form, a line of Old English poetry consists of 4 stressed syllables. The first 3 of those stressed syllables will be alliterative. They will all start with the same sound, and the last one will not be alliterative. The exact number of syllables in between these stressed syllables is unimportant to the formation of the line, but what matters is the 4 stressed syllables, 3 of them with alliteration. Most of these lines are also split up in the midpoint, right here, with a bit of a pause, just a natural kind of pause in the line as it is spoken. Let's take an example from the Old English version of the Battle of Maldon. Hia sheal de heandra, heore de senra, mod sheal de mare, de ure mayen litlad. So as you can see, I have bolded the particularly emphasized syllables in these lines. In our first line here, the H sound is our alliterative sound, with senre being our one non-alliterative word, and in the second line, it is the M sound, with again, the non-alliterative emphasized syllable at the end. All of a sudden, this feels like an English class in a way that I'm not entirely comfortable with, but Tolkien borrowed this poetic meter and rhythm for his poem, and he translated it into the English language quite beautifully. Take this line, for example. "The world withers and the wind rises, the candles are quenched, cold falls the night." The alliteration is there, the pattern is there, even that quite natural pause in the middle of each line. This isn't the rollicking rhythm that we hear in Shakespeare, to be or not to be, that is the question, nor is it the very lyrical, flowing, rhyming poetry that so many of us encounter today. It is a sturdy and earthy kind of poetry that serves the story that Tolkien is telling perfectly. Tolkien isn't insistent on following this poetic structure. He doesn't let the poetry become more important than the story he's telling, but he does show how the poetic techniques of the old world are such an excellent tool for telling a story that has a foot in those very times. He even borrows lines from the original Battle of Maldon poem. Once Tida and Toda have finally gotten the body of Beorhtnoth onto the cart and they're driving back to Ely, Toda falls asleep, and he has a dream. In his dreams, as he's speaking aloud, he's watching the world pass him by. He's watching dust gather in the corners of time. But all of a sudden, there's a light in the dark. Lo! Fire now wakens! Hearth is burning, house is lighted, men there gather, out of the mists they come, through darkling doors whereat doom waiteth. Hark! I hear them in the hall chanting. Stern words they sing with strong voices. Heart shall be bolder, harder be purpose, more proud the spirit as our power lessens. Mind shall not falter, nor mood waver, though doom shall come and dark conquer. That last chanted section, which acts as a crystal clear declaration of the old style of heroism, is borrowed and translated from the Maldon poem. Here, Tolkien is folding time in on itself. This story technically takes place after the events described in the Battle of Maldon poem, but it also shows how a young, inspired, troubled artist like Toda, who has seen the scene of this battle, may be the kind of person that would go on to write the Battle of Maldon poem later in life, even borrowing lines that he had heard in a dream to be used in the poem that he wrote. The scathing critique of old world heroism that shapes the homecoming of Beorhtnoth is not an invention by Tolkien. It does exist in the original poem. The explanatory essay that Tolkien wrote in order to validate the presence of the homecoming of Beorhtnoth in a book of essays is titled Offermode, which is a very peculiar Old English word used to describe Beorhtnoth's actions during the Battle of Maldon. Offermode is a word that doesn't have an exact translation in modern English, but could best be translated as overwhelming pride. And the context within which this word is used implies that offermode in itself is not inherently evil. Rather, an excess of offermode, particularly if you are in a position of power, can quickly tip over into being evil. The poem puts this iconic line that really embraces good offermode, hearts shall be bolder, harder be purpose, more proud the spirit as our power lessens, in the voice of Berhtwald, a follower of Beorhtnoth. And the poem praises this thinking when it is coming from Berhtwald, because Berhtwald is not a leader, he's just a follower. When an individual is put into a situation against which he cannot win, when he's put into a lose-lose situation between a rock and a hard place, and he still fights back when his purpose becomes bolder and stronger despite the fact that doom looms over him, that is an honorable thing. The problem is that when it comes to leaders, they can't have the excuse that they've been put into this situation and thus must fight back against overwhelming doom, because they're the person who put themselves and their followers in that situation in the first place. There is nothing honorable about a leader who takes his men into a situation in which having a prideful death is the only option. A leader should be responsible, and although offermode is great when it comes to situations where you are not the person putting yourself and others into that situation, for a leader, an excess of offermode can be and has proven itself to be deadly. In the case of Beorhtnoth, Tolkien draws a firm dividing line between heroism and chivalry. In his essay Offermode, he explains, Beorhtnoth was chivalrous rather than strictly heroic. Honor was in itself a motive, and he sought it at the risk of placing all the men most dear to him in a truly heroic situation, which they could only redeem by death. Magnificent, perhaps, but certainly wrong. He died for his folly. But it was a noble error, or the error of a noble. As we saw in the story of Beowulf, it could be honorable, if not a bit unwise, for a young hero to put themselves in a situation where they are set up to lose. Beowulf faced Grendel alone and unarmed, but his victory in this situation where doom was almost a certainty was the thing that made his legend so legendary. The example of young, rash Beowulf is a great example of good Offermode, or at the very least admirable Offermode. But by the time of his final battle, Beowulf has become a different person. He has more responsibilities now, and the Offermode that was a good thing in his youth no longer serves him. He could have fought that dragon with an entire army. He could have waited for a younger and more able hero to come and save him, but he was too proud, and his Offermode led to him being killed, leaving his entire kingdom undefended and alone. In The Homecoming of Beorhtnoth, Tolkien very specifically centers not the hero, but the people who are left behind when the dust settles. One of Tita's final lines reads, "It's night right enough, but there's no firelight. Dark is over all, and dead is master. When morning comes, it'll be much like others, more labor and loss till the land's ruined. Ever work and war till the world passes." It's all well and good for the heroes of storybooks to make big grand gestures and heroic stands, but the reality is that somebody has to come and pick up the bodies, that the workers will still have to go into work the next morning. Even with great men fallen and evil men slain, and a whole field of corpses lying just beyond the gate, the common man, the rest of us, have to keep moving forward. I believe that this sentiment was one deeply personal to Tolkien. He was shipped out to the First World War in 1916, and there he saw pain and death on an unimaginable scale. Having grown up on tales of the old glory, of war and victory, of heroes on the battlefield, Tolkien looked around and saw none of it. Certainly some men got to sit in their nice uniforms in their comfortable offices, dreaming of what a noble story this would all make, but for those that Offermode led them to stamp down into the mud and blood of the trenches on the pathway to nobility, it did not feel like a particularly heroic story. But even when the bloodshed had ended, the horrors didn't stop there, because Tolkien was one of the people who had to experience all of that and then go home. He had witnessed death on an industrial scale, the kind of scale that even a hero like Beowulf would balk at. His closest friends had been killed, and his vision of what the world and history were completely shattered. And he just had to go back home and find a job and act like the world was still whole. Tolkien is both Tita and Tora, shuffling through the corpses of a shattered world. He is the young dreamer, the fire of the old heroism hot in his veins, seeking to spin a story from tragedy. And he is the old man, forced to sit back and watch as Offermode claims yet another generation of people for the slaughter. This play was developed in the years following the Second World War, and I can't help but see some parallels there, at least in the ways that Tolkien talked about the war. Tolkien wrote to his son about how the utter stupid waste of war, not only material but moral and spiritual, is so staggering to those who have to endure it, and always was, despite the poets, and always will be, despite the propagandists. Many of Tolkien's Old English fanfictions are written through this feeling. Tolkien wasn't trying to write escapism. He wasn't seeking to glorify the kinds of things that he knew, in fact, were truly horrible in reality. In his Old English rewrites, Tolkien is reckoning with the passage of time, with what heroism was and what it must continue to be in the modern age. He saw the roots of this problem in the literature that he loved, and he took those roots and pulled until he could construct a new story from the ghosts of the old. One of the main refrains that I hear about adaptations and rewrites, and really any material that attempts to utilize old material in a new setting, is that they are defacing the story, that they are taking this original pure story and infusing all of their ideas and their modern agendas into a place where they don't belong. But I would like to ask people who make that complaint what else they think storytelling is for. What's the point of a rewrite or an adaptation but to take old material and change it, to turn it into something new, told through a new voice? This is something that Tolkien was quite adept at, and although his values are not necessarily modern values, he was updating older stories for a new audience and for his new perspectives. Of course, a retelling can be done well and it can be done poorly, but it's worth recognizing that it is in the very nature of stories to change, and even someone as pedantic and particular as J.R.R. Tolkien recognized that and dabbled in a little bit of fan fiction of his very own. Stories are a playground where we are able to turn ideas on their heads, to re-examine them, to test out new ideas, even if it is in a familiar and safe and old format. Tolkien used his masterful understanding and absolute adoration for older stories to shape new ones, to shape a new mythos and legend for a new world, and I, for one, could not be more pleased with the precedent that he set. If you have not read The Homecoming of Beorhtnoth, Beorhtholm's son, your homework for this video is to go and read it. It's not particularly long, and there are plenty of PDFs available of it online for free, although the edited version by Christopher Tolkien is a blast and has a lot of really interesting information if you're willing to spend money in order to read this thing. But either way, go and read it. It's so interesting. And I can't believe it took me this long to read it personally, so I'm taking that out on you. In the comments, let me know if you've ever read any of these stories, and if you have, let me know what you thought about them. Okay, I would say that you guys have waited long enough. Here is the thing that I teased at the beginning of this video.
What wegarena in Yaragum, Theor kuninga thrum Jefrunon, Huda Athalingas Ellen Fremeron.
I have been working on this project for months, ever since I had the idea for it when I did my first Beowulf video, and it is so exciting to see it all come to fruition. This is going to be coming out on Hobbit Day, September 22nd, but if you want to see it a day early on the 21st, I'm going to be posting it on my Patreon, and I will be doing a little Q&A situation, just talking about it on the Discord for my Patreon. So if you're interested in that, that is linked below. Be sure to like and subscribe if you like the kind of stuff I'm doing over here, and be sure to send this video to your friend who's an Old English nerd. Hopefully you have one of those. I assume you do if you're watching this channel. Thank you so much for joining me this week and every week, and I hope that you have a very happy, hobbity day.